Brazil is the largest country in South America, the fifth largest in the world. But size alone doesn't explain what Brazil is. Some historians suggest Brazil was never built to be one thing. It was built to contain everything. Stand in Sao Paulo on an ordinary morning. The city stretches in every direction. 22 million people. The largest city in the Southern Hemisphere. Japanese restaurants next to Afro-Brazilian terreiros. Portuguese colonial architecture beside modernist concrete towers. Indigenous street names beneath European surnames. Brazil is a country where everything arrived from somewhere else and then became something entirely new. It is the world's largest Portuguese-speaking nation, the world's largest Catholic country, home to the largest Japanese diaspora outside Japan, the largest African diaspora of any country outside Africa. And beneath all of this diversity, some historians suggest 5 forces that shaped Brazil long before anyone thought to name them, still operating today. Quietly, what the textbooks say. Brazil was claimed by Portugal in 1500. Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived on the coast of what is now Bahia on the 22nd of April. He found a land already inhabited by hundreds of indigenous nations, speaking dozens of languages, living across an extraordinary range of ecosystems. For the next 3 centuries, Brazil existed as a Portuguese colony. Sugar plantations in the northeast, gold mines in Minas Gerais, cattle ranches in the south, and running through all of it the slave trade. Between 1,500 and 1,888, Brazil received approximately 4.9 million enslaved Africans, more than any other country in the Americas. Slavery was not abolished in Brazil until 1888, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so. In 1822, Brazil declared independence from Portugal, peacefully. By the standards of the age, the Portuguese Prince Regent declared himself Emperor Pedro I of Brazil, a monarchy in a continent of republics. That monarchy lasted until 1889, when a military coup established the republic. The official story presents Brazilian history as a gradual progression toward democracy and development, a country finding itself. But finding implies a single thing to be found. Brazil, some historians suggest, was always multiple things at once, and the forces that made it so are still at work. Force 1, the Amazon. The Amazon rainforest covers approximately 5.5 million square kilometers. It produces roughly 20% of the world's oxygen. It contains 10% of all species on Earth. And for most of Brazilian history, it was ungoverned space. Not empty, never empty, but beyond the reach of the colonial state, the plantation economy, the Republican government. The Amazon was where people went when they were fleeing something. Indigenous nations retreating from colonization, escaped enslaved people establishing quilombos, free communities in the forest, rubber tappers building lives beyond the plantation system. Some historians suggest that the Amazon functioned not simply as a natural resource, but as a social pressure valve, a space large enough to absorb the overflow of a society built on extreme inequality. One interpretation holds that Brazil's relative social stability compared to other countries built on similar foundations of colonial extraction and slavery was partly a function of the forest. When the contradictions of Brazilian society became unbearable, there was always somewhere to go. The record shows a country that has consistently treated the Amazon as a frontier, a place of future promise, a place of present escape. What it doesn't show is what happens when the frontier closes. When the forest is gone, and the pressure valve is sealed. That question, some historians suggest, is the most important one Brazil has ever faced. Force 2. The African Foundation. Brazil received more enslaved Africans than any other country in the Americas. That is a documented fact. What is less often discussed is what those millions of people brought with them. Not just labor, knowledge, religion, music, language, food, medicine, architecture, Yoruba, Fon, Bantu, Yue. Dozens of African cultures arrived in Brazil across 3 centuries, and they did not disappear. They transformed. Candomblé, the Afro-Brazilian religious tradition, synthesized Yoruba spiritual practice with Catholic iconography. It survived 3 centuries of prohibition. It is still practiced today by millions. Capoeira, the Afro-Brazilian martial art disguised as dance, was developed by enslaved people as a form of resistance and self-defense. It is now a UNESCO-recognized cultural heritage. Brazilian Portuguese absorbed thousands of words from African languages. The cuisine of Bahia, considered by many the heart of Brazilian cooking, is inseparable from West African culinary traditions. Some historians suggest that the African contribution to Brazilian culture is not an influence. It is a foundation. One interpretation holds that what makes Brazil distinctively Brazilian, the music, the religiosity, the physical expressiveness, the particular warmth of its social culture, cannot be understood without understanding the African civilizations that built it from below. The record shows a country whose most celebrated cultural exports, samba, bossa nova, capoeira, carnival, are all rooted in African tradition. What it doesn't show is how long it took Brazil to acknowledge that, or how much of that foundation remains unacknowledged still. Force 3. The racial mixing. Brazil developed a concept that has no precise equivalent in any other language. Mestiçagem, the mixing of races European, African, indigenous into something new. The official Brazilian narrative, developed in the 20th century, celebrated this mixing as the foundation of a unique national identity. The Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire argued in 1933 that Brazil had achieved something no other society had managed: a genuine racial democracy, a place where the boundaries between races were fluid rather than fixed. That argument has been extensively challenged. Brazil has significant racial inequality. The legacy of slavery is visible in income, education, and life expectancy data. And yet, some historians suggest that mestiçagem, whatever its limitations, as a political narrative, describes something real about Brazilian social life. That the boundaries between racial categories in Brazil are genuinely different from those in, for example, the United States. More porous, more contested, more complex. One interpretation holds that this complexity is not a solution to the problem of race, but it is a different kind of problem, one that resists simple categorization. The record shows a country that is simultaneously one of the most racially diverse and one of the most racially unequal societies on Earth. What it doesn't show is whether those two facts are connected, or in contradiction. Perhaps in Brazil they are both. Force 4. The plantation legacy. Brazil's economy was built on sugar. For 2 centuries, from roughly 1550 to 1750, sugar was the most valuable commodity in the world, and Brazil was its primary source. The sugar plantation, the engenho, was not simply an agricultural enterprise. It was a total social system, the plantation owner at the center, the enslaved workforce at the base. the Catholic priest providing spiritual legitimacy, the local militia providing physical control, everything organized around the production of a single commodity for export. Some economic historians suggest that the plantation model, the organization of land, labor, and power around commodity extraction for foreign markets, did not end with slavery. It adapted from sugar to coffee, from coffee to rubber, from rubber to soybeans, from soybeans to iron ore. One interpretation holds that Brazil's recurring pattern of commodity booms and busts, extraordinary wealth generated, then lost, then generated again in a different product, is a direct inheritance of the plantation logic. Extract, export, repeat. The record shows a country that has been among the world's leading exporters of primary commodities for 5 centuries. What it doesn't show is how much wealth that generated and where it went. The plantation made some people very rich. It was not designed to distribute that richness. And some historians suggest that design is still visible in Brazilian society today. Force 5. The jeitinho. There is a Brazilian concept that resists direct translation. The jeitinho brasileiro. Roughly the Brazilian way of finding a way. When the rules don't work, when the system is broken, when the official path is blocked. The jeitinho is the art of finding another path, not through corruption, though it can shade into that, through creativity, improvisation, personal connection, flexibility. The jeitinho is celebrated and criticized in equal measure within Brazil. Celebrated as evidence of Brazilian resilience, warmth, and ingenuity. Criticized as a cultural tolerance for rule bending that undermines institutional trust. Some sociologists suggest the jeitinho was not invented. It was evolved. In a country where official systems were built to serve colonial extraction rather than ordinary people, where laws were designed by elites for elites, the ability to navigate around formal structures was not a choice. It was a survival skill. One interpretation holds that the jeitinho is a rational response to 5 centuries of institutions that did not function for the majority of the population. That when official channels consistently fail, informal channels become not just acceptable, but necessary. The record shows a country with extraordinary levels of informal economic activity, social creativity, and communal problem solving. What it doesn't show is whether those same qualities make it harder to build the formal institutions that might, eventually, make the jeitinho unnecessary. Perhaps Brazil is still deciding. Conclusion. Brazil contains more contradictions than most countries ever produce. The world's largest tropical forest and one of the fastest rates of deforestation. Extraordinary cultural richness built on extraordinary suffering. A society that celebrates mixing while maintaining deep inequality. An economy of vast natural wealth that has never quite reached the people who live above it. 5 forces, all still operating. The Amazon still defining the possibilities and limits of Brazilian space. The African Foundation still shaping what Brazil sounds, tastes, and feels like. The racial complexity still resisting simple answers. The plantation logic still directing the flow of wealth outward. The jeitinho still finding ways through systems that were never built for everyone. None of these forces are problems to be solved. They are the texture of a civilization, the shape of a country that was assembled from more pieces, from more cultures, more continents, more centuries than almost anywhere else on Earth. To understand Brazil is not to resolve its contradictions. It is to hold them, all 5, at once. The countries that hold the most contradictions are often the ones with the most to teach. Next, the hidden forces that shaped Argentina's identity. This video explores history and disputed theories for educational purposes.